Welcome once again to heartofashepherd.com. I do invite you to subscribe not only to the YouTube channel but also to the daily devotional. Well, we are nearing the end of David's life, and so we expect, as we find today, 2 Samuel chapter 23 is the last will and testament of King David. We'll see tomorrow, chapter 24, his last words. I do invite you to consider with me today the scripture reading, 2 Samuel chapter 23. But first we'll begin with Psalm 57. Psalm 57. I've titled this chapter, God is Our Refuge. You'll notice the title that is there, attributing David as the author and the time of which he was reflecting on. Now, I believe that this Psalm 57 was penned near the end of David's life at a time of reflection, as those who are often on the deathbed do. They began to think back over life, the past. Fortunately for David, being a godly man, he recalled the mercies of God. And so I invite you to notice Psalm 57 verse 1 through 6. What I would suggest is a prayer for God's mercy. Now, again, I believe he penned this in the latter years of his life, and he was looking back on the time in which he was forced to flee the palace of King Saul and to live a fugitive's life. Some 10 years he spent in the wilderness. Well, when he hid in the wilderness, he sought refuge in the caves. And we read in verse 1 that there he cried, Be merciful unto me, O God, be merciful unto me, for my soul trusteth in thee. What a wonderful thought that is, that David, though he was stalked by enemies, found in his words, really in a metaphor, refuge in the shadow of God's wings. There in verse 3, he cried out for the Lord's mercy and his longing for the truth. He acknowledged, as you look at verse 4, that his enemies were like savage lions, ready to ravage him with their words and their tongue a sharp sword. And then he continues to make the observation in verse 6, though, acknowledging who those adversaries were, their scheme to entrap him. But David took rejoicing in this, that those who had laid traps for him ended up perishing in their own wickedness. And then, as David often does in his Psalms, you're going to notice beginning in verse 5 and then verse 7 through 11, his song of praise and thanksgiving. Well, despite the sorrows and humiliations, David's foremost desire, as you read verse 5, was that the Lord would be exalted and glorified above all the earth. In fact, he goes on in verse 7, and he gives this testimony, my heart is fixed. Oh God, my heart is fixed. Literally, it's set. It's ready. Oh, inside the emotions might have been washing over him like the waves of the sea. But in his faith, David had set himself in the place of trusting the Lord. And so he says, I will sing and give praise. Well, with a heart of thanksgiving, David even expressed a desire that through his testimony and his life and all that he had seen, that all the earth might know the mercies of God. In fact, he says in verse 8, I will awake early, such as it is, when the sun rises for God's people. We ought to first think of the Lord. Thank him for a new day. Thank him for the opportunities that are set before us. What a merciful, loving God we serve. Now that brings us to really the heart of today's devotional, and that is 2 Samuel chapter 23. As I've already mentioned, here we have the last words and the testament of King David. Now, we have been privileged to follow the life of the king from his boyhood now to his old age. He died at the age of around 70 years old. And so he's reflecting back now on his life. This man whom God declared a man after his own heart is somebody you and I should be very interested in not only in his youth and the strength of his youth and adulthood, but now in the latter days of his life. Now, you and I both know the king was far from perfect. However, what we have seen as the overriding testimony of his life is his tenderness towards the Lord and his love for God's word and law. Indeed, David has been an inspiration to believers of every generation. Would you take a moment and notice with me 2 Samuel 23 and verse 1? Here we read, "Now these be the last words of David." Now, that phrase moves me emotionally as a pastor. You know, I've been honored to be at the bedside of dying saints, and I've been privy of their last words. I've seen in the lives and the faces of those who were dying and the imminence of death shadowing their life, how death stirs in a soul a reflection on things that genuinely matter in the light of eternity. You see, death's shadow removes things that once held pride and affection. I mean, after all, what good are trophies and honors and plaques and memorials to a dead man? And so death has a way of causing us to really realize the things that really have value in light of eternity. Now, David, for all of his achievements and the accolades that summed up David's life, he's the giant slayer of Goliath. He's the mighty warrior of Israel. He's the victor over the Philistines. And yet those are not the things of which David boasted. Instead, as you look at verse 1 and you look at verse 2, David describes himself simply as the son of Jesse, a man that was a shepherd. The man who was David raised up on high. David described himself as the anointed of the God of Jacob, and I love this phrase, and the sweet psalmist of Israel. He's not interested in the honors and the praise of women in the streets as they praised him after he had slain Goliath and after he had gone to war and he had killed thousands of Philistines. No, those are not the honors that David takes to his grave. In fact, he takes to his grave not only the fact that he had served as the king, but better than that he had been privileged to be the sweet psalmist of Israel. By that meaning, the one by whom the Spirit of the Lord spake. What a precious, wonderful description of a man near death. Notice with me verse 3 through 7. And here we see the wisdom and adoration of David as he once again identifies the Lord as the rock of Israel. And then he remembered God's counsel, God's appeal, in 2 Samuel 23 and verse 3, when the Lord told him, "He that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God." Think about how profound that is. He that rules, he that leads, he that is the shepherd of men must be righteous and must rule in the fear of God. How different our world would be if people desired just leaders, righteous leaders, leaders who ruled in the fear of God and according to God's law. Can you imagine the joy of a nation, a people, a church led by men who rule in the fear of God? Such leaders would be, verse 4, as the light of the morning when the sun riseth. I've lived and seen many presidents arise and sit in the Oval Office in Washington, D.C. I've seen some bring hope and others bring sorrow and dismay and even despair. Oh, that God would give us leaders once again that rule with a reverence for God and a love for his word. Now, continue with me as we look at the later verses that we find, 2 Samuel 23. Now, the rule of men who rule as the light of the morning dispels darkness and ignorance. You see, we find in this study the essence of a great man. He is not one who has necessarily slain giants, but he is one through whom God has worked. He is a just man. For David, the fact that he had the privilege of speaking the words of God was the highest point of that great man's life. Don't forget, though, that behind David, the great king, were great men. Now, as you begin in verse 8 and read through verse 39, you see a list of men, and time and space restrain me from an exhaustive study, but still, I want to encourage you that it is worth noting that near the end of his life, David took time to acknowledge those men who had been his mighty men. 2 Samuel 23 and verse 33 gives the number of David's great warriors as 30. And yet the chapter ends stating there were 37 men in all. Now, how might that be? The number 30 or the number 37? Is there an error here? Also, you'll note that there are also 36 men named and not 37. Now, some might disagree with my assessment of the dilemma between the number 30, 36, and 37 of David's mighty men. However, I believe an acceptable explanation is simply this. When some of David's mighty men perished in battle, for instance, the very last verse, verse 39, mentions Uriah the Hittite, David would have chosen other men to take their place. Also, I believe the 37th man was the one that is not named in this passage, and perhaps it was Joab, the brother of Abishai, whom I think was in a league as a leader all of his own. 37 mighty men from different backgrounds, but all who had dedicated their lives to serve David. You see, the son of Jesse was the great warrior king, and yet he was content to be remembered as the man with whom God established an everlasting covenant. Perfect man? No. But you know, that is the kind of leader that God uses. And we close with 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 26 through 29. And here Paul writes, and he reminds us of this. You see, your calling, brethren, in verse 26 of 1 Corinthians 1, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. Isn't it amazing that the man that is the one to whom we all look today as the king of Israel was David? That Jesus Christ came into this world as the son of David through Mary, his birth mother, through Joseph, his adopted earthly father, and both of them traced their roots to David. But who was David? He was a shepherd. He was the son of Jesse. We continue in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 28, that God has chosen the base things of the world, and the things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and the things which are not, to bring to naught things that are. Now, why would God choose foolish men, or at least men foolish in the eyes of the world? The simple men who do not have a bloodline that stands out as one that would impress others. Why does God choose those kind of men? Well, the answer is 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 29. And here we read that no flesh should glory in his presence. What made David great was that his primary, foremost interest was God's glory. May that be a lesson that you and I would follow. Not our glory, not our honors that will die with us, but that our life would be a testimony of a man or a woman who glorifies the Lord with all our being. God bless you. Thank you for being a part of Heart of a Shepherd. Bye-bye.